Hey guys, Dan O'Day here, and I have a special guest, a chap I've known for many years, Jeff Zyncinski, and Jeff is the author of a book that I know you'll be interested in. It's called The Red Light Zone, and I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but I think we can guess. It's The Red Light Zone, an insider's laugh and tell of BBC Radio. Oh, this is a radio book.
Yes.
Oh. Great. So, hey, Jeff, how you doing?
I'm very well. Good to see you. It's been many years now.
Same here. It's been a long time. And we're making this video because you were kind enough to send me a copy of the book, and I thought it was really good. And as a matter of fact, I'll tell you this now. I made a bunch of notes, most of which, by the way, I can't read, which is really, really helpful.
Yes, I know that.
All these notes here that I scribbled down, and I'm going, what? It makes them natural. But one of the notes I made was that this is really well written, and that's a nice surprise. Not everyone who writes a memoir based on his or her career knows how to write engagingly and entertainingly. And so who really wrote this for you?
It was you.
Well, thank you. I know you've written your entire career for your various jobs. Do you feel that you're a natural writer? Is this?
I've always loved writing. With radio and writing, my two greatest loves, I suppose. And with this book, I'm not anyone famous. I'm at best a kind of middle manager. I was a middle manager in the BBC. So the key for me was, how can I take my story, make it entertaining, and make it personal, rather than, I'm very suspicious of those kind of business leadership books, where they kind of retrofit a strategy to lucky success. And you never get to hear about many failures other than, I sorted out the failures of others. And you never get to hear about the person's family or how they balance their family life with their job. And so I thought, I'll write this book and I'll tell it all. I'll tell it all in a way that I think is entertaining, because I found the job fun for all those years, and I wanted to communicate that sense of fun.
The book just starts right into the story, and the way you tell it, it all just flows kind of naturally. Your career, just kind of flows, which is unlike the careers of most radio people I know, including me, which is a series of catastrophes, each one leading to a higher level catastrophe. But you just seem to have glided through your career.
I had a lot of good luck when you consider that when I joined the BBC, I wrote them a letter saying, I'm not really qualified for the job that you're advertising, but can you see me anyway? As you can imagine, the BBC and its hierarchy and its organisational structure is a mystery to those who don't work for it. And they advertised this job as an executive producer, which to me sounded like, almost like the president of a company. Mm-hmm. I was a senior reporter in commercial radio at the time. So I wrote and said, look, I'd love to work for you, but I'm being realistic. I don't think I can make the leap from my job to the job you're advertising, but can I come in and talk to you anyway? So they interviewed me, and then they produced this letter and said, are you crazy? Why have you added this letter? And I said, well, just being honest. So they said, well, you're right, you're not qualified for this job. And I went home and I got a call about an hour later saying, can you come back in? And they offered me a different job in a kind of outpost of the BBC in Scotland.
Just imagine how much better it would have gone if in your letter you had said, I'm really not interested in your job. I really think BBC is beneath me. The title, The Red Light Zone, is the red light that goes on in the studio. Trust me, there are no interesting, lascivious stories that I could find about any red light zone.
Well, there was a strip club. It was my first paid job. I was asked by Capital Radio in London to take part in a project that they were running called A Day in the Life of London. And lots of students were involved in that, and they apportioned the tasks depending on the likelihood of success. And they took a look at me and said, you look like someone who could blend into the background of a seedy Soho strip club. Would you like to go to the Paul Raymond Review Bar and stay there for 24 hours? And I said, I'm the man for that. It was, how on earth do you translate stripping and nudity into audio? But luckily there was a kind of sleazy bouncer who followed me around all day and narrated events for me.
Now, when reading it, it seemed like at any moment he was going to throw you out or something. Did it become clear to you what his purpose was? Like, was he keeping an eye on you? Was he trying to get his 10 minutes of fame or something else?
It was certainly told to keep an eye on me in case I had some ulterior motive, perhaps to expose what was really going on in the club, and this whole thing had been a setup. And I've encountered that many times in my career, that people thinking that this can't be true. You must have some other reason to be here. And we might come to of the time I was recording in Hollywood and met gang members from Compton who didn't believe we were there to record or to broadcast a live BBC radio show, and became convinced this was an FBI setup. You know, the way they have these sting operations.
Now, was it really FBI, or would it be the Yard that was doing the setup, Scotland Yard?
Well, it could have been very good FBI, well disguised with Scottish accents. You know,
that's true. There's a brand new show on the telly right now, CSI Aberdeen. So you never know. Just let me get this straight. They went to a bunch of university students.
Yes.
And said, hey, we're doing this thing. We give you some valuable experience. And they sent you to a strip club.
Yes. I mean, other people got to go in police helicopters and on the London Underground, and to go to market stalls in Carnaby Street. But they looked at me and said, you're the strip club guy.
Am I correct in remembering that you got paid for that also?
Yes, I got £40.
Just for all the radio people watching, understand his very first real exposure to radio was as a university student. He was asked to go spend 24 hours at a strip club, and they paid him. You begin by saying, by and large, people and events recalled in this book are done so with respect and affection. And I want to ask you a question about that. But first, tell me about the big scam, the Scottish scam centered around dolphin watching.
Well, I now live in the north of Scotland, in Inverness, and on the coast, which is called the Moray Firth. And the biggest tourist element of that is people getting on boats to go and see dolphins, or standing on a particular part of the coastline to see dolphins. And it's very, very popular, and lots of businesses make a living out of it. I myself am sceptical. I have stood on that point of the land looking out to sea, and if there were dolphins there, they were certainly well in the distance, splashing. And I often observe, they're not very interesting, these real dolphins. I mean, the ones you get in amusement parks where they kind of jump through hoops and catch fish, they've got to be much better than real dolphins. But this is the kind of comment that would get you hounded out of Scotland, I think.
You're saying that the dolphins in the ocean don't jump through hoops and stuff like that?
No, really dull dolphins. Yeah.
Because I'm in Southern California, and our equivalent is whale watching.
Mm-hmm.
And I made the mistake once of agreeing to go whale watching, where you pay to get on a boat and it goes just a little bit out to see. And whale watching, in my experience, consists of this. So you're on that boat, you're looking, and then the captain or whoever says, "Oh, you just missed one right over there," and everyone looks at where the captain said there was one.
Yeah.
And you missed another one, right? Yeah. And every now and then you look and you see a tiny bit of water spurt up, which looks like the plumbing is backed up, and that's it. I was glad to see that Southern California is not the only place that touts a really boring activity as a tourist attraction. Again, by and large, people in events recalled in this book are done so with respect and affection. Who are the people that you talk about in the book with whom you are not regarding with the respect and affection?
I really wasn't going to write a book which was taking revenge on people, or people who'd slighted me in some way. It's not the kind of book I wanted to write. It might have been the kind of book that the newspapers would have wanted me to write, and certainly since its publication, various newspaper reporters have come calling and said, "Have you not got any dirt on such and such?" And I said, "No, it's not that kind of book. It's really meant to be an entertainment book," and they go away rather disappointed. But I think life's too short to, as I say, I really, really enjoyed my career. I thought I was really lucky to work for the BBC. And as you probably have noticed, the main theme of the book is the joke is usually on me with each of these stories. There's usually some calamity that befalls me rather than other people.
It's written with self-deprecation. You say how lucky I was, but also we can see through that, because we can tell when someone's secretly boasting. because,
Yes.
how lucky I was to have won the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
We get it. It's a charming book, and any radio person, I believe, would enjoy it. You grew up in Glasgow, yes?
That's right, yeah. The East End of Glasgow, I think you would call it a project, so it's a kind of housing scheme.
In certain parts of the country, it can be called the projects.
It was an area built in the 1950s. They were knocking down a lot of the old buildings in Glasgow, and they built this vast area and 5 miles on the outskirts. So they built lots of houses, but they forgot to build things like shops and cinemas and any kind of amenities. So it very quickly developed, sadly, a reputation for gang violence and things like that, which I personally never experienced. But on the other hand, I had 6 older brothers looking after me, so maybe that's why I never experienced any problems.
You grew up listening to Radio Clyde?
Yeah, there wasn't much radio to listen to. Unlike in the United States, where I think there's always been vast amounts of choice. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I think everything's crammed onto the dial.
That's actually the FCC slogan for American radio. Everything is crammed on the dial. That's the slogan.
Yes. So when I was growing up, there was, in terms of what you could hear in decent quality, there was 4 BBC stations. Then there was 5 BBC stations, and by the mid 1970s, local radio, independent local radio, Radio Clyde was launched. But that was it, really. And if you wanted something else, you had to go into the shortwave band and listen to international radio stations. And I listened to BBC World Service, obviously, but I also listened to Radio Prague and Radio Moscow and Voice of America and some of the American service stations for servicemen. And it just gave you this inkling of different kinds of radio across the dial. And remember, I was a teenager in an era when people didn't have televisions in their bedroom. They had radios in their bedrooms. So I would spend my evenings listening to these stations, and often listening right through the evening because you got a better reception in the darker hours. And therefore, I got a reputation at school for always being late because I was oversleeping. So they called me the late Mr. Zyncinski. You know what teachers can be like,
Teachers are they're nasty.
They spend too much time with children,
Teachers should not be allowed to be in the same room as children, and I support your worldwide initiative to ban teachers from the classroom, and I want to thank you for the good work you're doing.
Thank you.
So, what was it that was so interesting that you spent your evenings listening to the radio?
I think it was the sense of it's a cliche, the radio is better than television because the pictures are better. But the idea that you could listen to a music show, you could listen to drama, you could listen to a comedy show, you could listen to news and current affairs and learn so much, but also it filled your head with these wonderful images, and it was I just found it enchanting. In terms of Radio Clyde overnight, this was a time when the restrictions were such that they weren't allowed to play music all day, so they had a lot of speech and talk content overnight, and I started submitting these comedy detective stories to Radio Clyde overnight about a kind of Raymond Chandler, Philip Marlowe kind of detective called Nelson Pipsqueak, and I submitted these every week.
This is while you were in high school?
What?
Yeah,
while I was still in school, yes. I would work to a deadline of having a story ready for Saturday morning. I would catch the bus into the city centre, and I would hand deliver this story to the studios at Radio Clyde, only so that I could have a look at the reception area and peer down the corridors and see what a radio station was like, and it was always a joy if there was 2 or 3 people in front of me at the reception desk, because that gave me a bit longer to look around at the radio station. So you can tell I was an obsessive from quite an early age.
So would it be accurate to have referred to you as an anorak back then?
Yes.
And then later you went on to work for Radio Clyde.
Right? I did, yes, later on, yeah.
One would assume that was really exciting.
It was both exciting and then subsequently rather disappointing. My first job was in another local radio station here in Inverness, Murray Firth Radio, and that was a real joy. And that was a friendly atmosphere. It was a huge territory. The stories were just falling into my lap all the time. In Glasgow at Radio Clyde, the management style was very much like an old kind of newspaper office. It was quite macho. It was quite a lot of negative feedback rather than encouragement. And you learned a lot as a result through fear.
I know as a radio talent, a disc jockey or host, I know what negative feedback is like.
Yeah.
What is negative feedback like for a radio journalist?
When you work very hard and you rarely get any kind of praise, but you make the odd mistake here and there, and it seems like the world has come to an end. You know, the way you've pronounced a word. There was a great atmosphere in the newsroom. We all had this kind of prison mentality, I think. But there was a prison siege at one point, and it was late at night, and I was called at home to go out and cover this prison siege. So I came in and I got the outside broadcast vehicle and I took it out to the prison, and along with all the other reporters from other organisations, provided early bulletins, updates on what was happening. By the time 8 o'clock in the morning came, another reporter came to relieve me, but she needed the outside broadcast vehicle. And so I got a taxi back into Glasgow. So when I once had a glimpse of my personnel file, one of the few things in it was, can't believe he got a taxi back and it cost £50.
Yeah, no mention of spending the entire night out.
No mention of we're providing national news across the UK about this prison siege. No, it was just about why did he get a tax? I've seen you speak about this in terms of a manager giving feedback to on-air talent, and we all know that you can have this praise sandwich whereby you say that was really good, what you did really at the beginning of the hour was really good, what you did at the end of the hour was fantastic, just a small thing you did in the middle we could improve upon, and the only thing the talent remembers is the bit in the middle.
They teach that to some managers. Say something nice, criticize, and then say something. Not only is that the only thing we hear, but that conditions us so that when the manager says something nice to us, we're going, okay, and but what? Just skip that part, get to the part where you're going to make me feel lousy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the joy was not just in hitting those deadlines, but in beating the competition. So beating the BBC to a news story was always good fun.
Is that because the BBC had an unlimited budget and unlimited numbers?
Yes, they had. It looked that way anyway. When you were on the outside, it looked like they had one reporter for every single story, whereas a commercial radio reporter was working 8 hours and doing 5 different jobs throughout the day.
There's a term you used in your book with which I'm not familiar when you were working for Moray Firth Radio, and you said our main competitor for news was BBC Radio Scotland, or more specifically, the opt-out service, BBC Radio Highland.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to admit, I don't know what an opt-out, it sounds like you send them an email so they could opt out of your radio station, but I think this was before email. So what's an opt-out station?
So you've got Radio Scotland broadcasting on a series of transmitters around the country. So there's one, for instance, not very far from where I'm sitting just now, just across the river. In the local studios in Inverness, you can flick a switch and take over just that transmitter. So therefore you can provide very local news, and that very local news was the opt-out service. So Radio Scotland's opt-out for the Highlands was BBC Radio Highland.
So the opt-outing was being done by the radio station, not by the listeners.
Yes, that's right, yes.
This might be the one thing that I tell radio people, I do seminars and stuff around the world, and I think this is, of all the things I say that they don't believe, I think this is the one they most don't believe. When you worked for Radio Clyde, did they already have a certain amenity at the radio station, or was that afterwards?
You're talking about the wet?
Yes. What did they have?
They had a swimming pool and a gym.
And this is inside the complex, the building.
And it's still there, I think. And inside the quite vast studio complex that they built after moving from the city centre to the outskirts, so to Clydebank, as it were. And that swimming pool was quite good for their reputation for recruiting people. So you imagine it's, you should come and work for us. We've got a swimming pool. It was a great signal that this is a fantastic employer, with forward thinking, worrying about the health of its employees. Latterly, they cut back on the security staff, and you couldn't use the swimming pool because there was nobody there to make sure you were safe. So for many years, it's just something we talked about.
Oh, really? But I can picture it ultimately being filled with promo records, the no water. And
they would say filled with our awards. Where else are we going to put our awards? We'll have to put them
in. You could have put a dolphin or two, I think, would have been a nice touch. Yeah, that's the only radio station of which I'm aware that has or had a swimming pool. And I know you've been to American radio stations. You actually worked for a bit in American radio. Typical American radio station, forget swimming pool. We're really happy if we have a bathroom. Or a loo. I'm surprised that you were allowed to continue to work for the BBC after you apparently offended the royal family.
Yes. How would you say Margaret as a name?
Well, having heard you say it, I would say it as Margaret.
Yeah. Whereas in Glasgow, what we would say is Margaret. Margaret, So among my many on-air blunders was saying, and we're expecting a visit today from Princess Margaret, so instead of Margaret.
Did you get scolded by management?
In the days before email, there was pigeonholes. Do you remember pigeonholes? A kind of a wooden box where you picked up your mail, like a mail collection kind of area.
I certainly know what you're talking about. I never worked at a radio station that had those, but
yeah,
most of us back then were illiterate, so there was no reason to know.
So you came in each morning and you collected your memos, your paper memos from your pigeonhole, and that told you where you had gone wrong the previous day. So
almost every day you come to work.
Almost every day. You start your day. Some people got more than others, but you collected these. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
In American radio, as you know, almost all of which is commercial. Among the many joys of working in radio is owners of the radio station who decide they want to help out with the programming, and even better, spouses of owners who will call to complain. So, like, did the Queen ever call up on the request line to ask for her favorite song or anything?
No, I'm afraid not. I don't think she ever listened to commercial radio. I don't think she knew it existed.
Because I have recordings, several different recordings of her calling Capital Radio and making requests. But you're saying never.
It may not be her.
Oh, I don't think so. I believe I would know her voice.
Yeah, well, you should maybe just have a kind of element of doubt there, is what I'm saying.
You talked about, I think at Moray Firth, you guys would talk at night. You couldn't play music.
It was called needle time, the needle time restrictions, where the regulator, the radio authority at the time, allowed these stations only to play so much commercial music. There was ways around it, so you could play Canadian music, I think, and you could play what was regarded as non-commercial music.
So if you played music nobody wanted to hear, that was okay?
Yeah. Which is a great slogan for a radio station.
You never get sick of our songs because you won't listen anyway.
So as a result, there was a lot of talking overnight, a lot of, reading out letters and, as I say, reading out short stories and playing this catalogue of Canadian music. For some reason, Canadian music was allowed. I can't remember the logic behind that. But
well, there's an irony there, because to this day, Canadian radio stations have to deal with the regulations that require Canadian content.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And apparently the Canadian government is more pushy than we realize, because somehow they made you guys play it too.
Yes, well, you know what those Canadians are like. Yeah.
I like to think that I operate on a higher plane than to, at this point, interject a joke about Anne Murray or Gordon Lightfoot. A lot of people would go there.
Yeah.
But that's really not.
I mean, what kind of joke, for instance, would you not do?
No, I would say, Canadian content, and how do the people in Glasgow like Anne Murray and Gordon Lightfoot? Because in America, that's what you would hear when I would visit Canada. You would hear a whole lot of the crossover artists, of which there were not many. And to our Canadian friends, I know that Canada has many great artists, but for the stations that wanted to sound like American pop stations, they did play an inordinate amount of Gordon Lightfoot. Mm-hmm. And which is fine, since all of his songs sound the same. So it worked out pretty well. Now, by the way, if I say anything interesting, it's because of Jeff's book, The Red Light Zone, an insider's laugh and tell of BBC Radio. Did I get that right?
That's right, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if I remember, I'll put on the screen a link where you can go get the book, and any radio person would appreciate it. And there's television in there too, a little bit. This is something I noticed in the book. You referred to it, but you didn't explain it. Exactly what were the instructions you were given for approaching Radio Clyde's traffic copter? I mean, it's like, don't make any sudden moves, don't make eye contact.
I never actually saw the helicopter. What I was trying to illustrate was how exciting it all seemed when you joined. There was a swimming pool, there was a huge newsroom, there was your gadgetry, and here were instructions on how to approach the helicopter. I never went near the helicopter. The helicopter was on a helipad somewhere, some distance away from the studios.
You know what would have been cool would be if the landing pad were atop the swimming pool. And so whenever take off, the roof would open.
Oh, you mean like the Thunderbirds or Batman or something like that?
Yeah,
you know?
yeah, exactly. That's how I would have done it had I accepted the job, as head of the radio station.
Yeah.
Oh, it's a great story though. The reason I didn't accept that job is they never offered me the job. So yeah, we'll take that out. If somebody were on a train, let's say, and somebody had accidentally left a copy of your book on the seat,
mm-hmm.
and somebody were to pick it up and they just had a few minutes to read, what's the part that you really enjoy them reading most? What part is dearest to you or most important or most meaningful or anything?
Well, I tell you that there's two stories in it that people keep coming back to that surprise me. And one is where I tell about a colleague's obsession with chips or fries, as you would call them.
Mm-hmm.
And this person, who was from the Human Resources Department, we had to go and hear disciplinary appeals in other parts of the BBC, and we got stuck at an airport once. And we went for something to eat in the kind of cafeteria of the airport, and he questioned whether the fries were fresh, and instructed the waiter to go away and make fresh fries. And afterwards I quizzed him about this, and I said, what's the deal with the fries? Why are you so obsessed with these fresh fries? And he explained in very long-winded terms how he often went into establishments and asked for a sample of each fry, and if they weren't up to scratch, he would leave. And then he found himself being banned from a kind of fast food shop because he
can't imagine why.
Yeah, because he wouldn't eat the chips, he wouldn't eat the fries that had been made 5 minutes earlier. And so he told me that he lurked outside this shop and asked kids to go in and buy these fries for him. And I said, that's sounding a wee bit suspect. And he went, I know. And so then he went with a friend and he kind of lurked in the background while his friend bought the fries. And this whole thing lasted for months. Went on for months.
What was this bloke's job title?
He was a very senior manager in the Human Resources Department.
Okay.
And it struck me that since it had taken him many months to buy these fries, I could see why disciplinary and performance management procedures in the BBC always took so long to resolve. If you can't buy a bag of...
Yeah, pretty much the only information you need is where the packets of ketchup, and
yes.
But not where you are. Probably it's vinegar, I'm guessing. But
yeah, something. Yeah. So there's that story, but there's the other story. You mentioned television earlier, and I once found myself. Do you know the program Who Wants to Be a Millionaire?
Yeah.
So when it was launched in the UK, it was a massive hit. It was frighteningly huge. It was sucking up every viewer who was watching television. But it was on commercial television, on ITV. And the word went around the BBC that we needed something to beat this show, to beat Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So every department in the BBC, Scotland, Wales, London, north of England, was charged with coming up with ideas to beat Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. And I stupidly...
I want to get this right. The BBC, the flagship broadcast operation for the world,
mm-hmm.
priority number one was beating Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. Yeah.
Now you've got to remember the panic that was going on. There was this show was attracting so many viewers that no one was watching anything else at all. It was so huge at that time. So I stupidly, at a meeting, opened my mouth with an idea. There's a qualifying round called Fastest Finger First, where you have to not only get the correct answer, but put them into the right chronological order or alphabetical order. And if you get through that, then you go into the main body of the studio and you answer the general knowledge questions. Those initial tasks of coordination and sequencing are very different from general knowledge mm-hmm. skill. So they require two different bits of the brain. And usually, if you're good at one thing, you're not so good at the other. It was neurologically fixed that the person who got into the hot seat was probably not going to be the strongest at answering general knowledge questions.
So they're self-selecting the dumber ones in terms of the questions.
Yeah, well, that was my theory. Mm-hmm. And since I had nothing to lose, I was espousing this theory, and I came up with I came up with this program idea called Brainwaves, testing the different parts of the brain. And the tagline was, the only person who will ever win £1 million on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire would be the BBC Brainwaves champion. So they said, you're the man, go to London and pitch this to the controller of BBC Television. And I said, what, me? And they said, yeah, you're the only one who understands this. The rest of us don't understand this at all.
Is this the meeting? Is this the meeting that had that amazing? Do you watch the television show W1A?
Yes. It was a W1A kind of episode, yeah.
There was, I don't know if it was the same pitch meeting that in the book, but you described a meeting that was right out of if you haven't seen W1A, it's a TV show, and it's really funny. What I love about it is it's a merciless parody of the BBC, produced by the BBC. Which
yes, and those of us who work for the BBC just thought as a very tame reality show because things
or a documentary.
Things in the BBC were much more absurd than.
And so, is this the same one? I don't want to give it away, but the same one where heads of a couple departments were at the table, and there was a little bit of discussion.
So what happened is the pitching sessions for these are in the 6th floor, or they were in the 6th floor of BBC's Television Centre in London. So about 10 of us from Glasgow got on a plane and we went to this meeting. We had folders ready to pitch these ideas, and of course I had my brainwaves idea. But as we went into the room, there was no one there yet, and there was a very long table. And there was a window on one side looking out to London, and the other side was a wall with a sideboard. And the sideboard was festooned with cut fruit. There was always fruit at BBC meetings in those days. I never quite understood why, in case scurvy was going to strike executives at any point. And so we all sat at one end, we all sat at one side of this long table. And the head of production turned to the head of entertainment and said, don't we usually sit on the other side of this table? And the head of entertainment said, no, it's always this side. He said, are you sure? I'm sure they sit on that side. No, I'm absolutely sure. We sit on this side. And the head of production was still not convinced. He said, I think it's the other side. And the head of production said, no, they sit on that side because they like to be near the fruit. And sure enough, when the executives all filed in, each one of them did a double take saying, oh, so you're sitting on that side today.
Oh.
And the next executive would say, oh, this is unusual. This is a bit of a change. You're sitting on that side. And gradually the head of his head was starting to explode with the tension. And the only person not to mention the seating arrangement was the head of television himself, who simply came in, cut himself a bit of satsuma and sat down and didn't mention that. But the only commission that we got that day was my brainwaves idea, which I then subsequently had to go and make.
So then you got to experience the joyful world of television program development, where you get an idea and the next thing you know, it's on screen. Is that pretty much the way it was for you?
You get an idea, and unlike radio, radio, you have an idea and you can go and make it, and it's usually the idea or approximately the idea you came up with in the first place. In television, there are so many people with a viewpoint and expertise to bring into the mix that the final product is very different from the one you imagined by the time everyone has had their say.
Is there a shorthand way of telling us what the process was that you went through and what the result was?
I had to learn quite a lot about getting a presenter, getting to a host for the show, and the original host, she became pregnant, so she wasn't available. Then someone else was suggested by London, and he would only do it if we were going to wire people's brains up to some kind of machinery that hadn't yet been invented outside the world of science fiction. So he wouldn't do it. And we eventually found a presenter, and then the set designer. The original set had so many jagged edges that people were in danger of kind of cutting themselves in half. And then we ended up simplifying the challenges to such an extent that it eventually mimicked a show that had already been broadcast in the 1970s. So the system at the time when you sent your kind of pilot program to London was it was either going to be green, a green lit commission, or it could be red saying, no, we don't want it, or it could be amber, meaning we've not yet made up our mind. And my program was given the title Amber, and it still has Amber status.
It still might be greenlit then.
I think it's unlikely, but I like to hope one day they'll come calling.
What did that bloke think was the viewer would see if you hooked up electrodes to the contestant's head? What were they going to see?
I think you were going to see waveforms, but
that's fascinating. That's great television.
Or perhaps someone's head blowing up. I wasn't quite sure. These days,
now that one, they're all wired up. Only one of them is going to explode. Who will it be? Now, there's a show I can get behind.
Yeah. You joke, Dan, but that will be on screen within 2 weeks. That's the way television's going.
Well, as I recall, in one of my absolute all-time favorite movies called Time Bandits,
yes,
an early Terry Gilliam film,
yeah,
they had this crazy game show on the telly, and it was so ridiculous that nobody would. And now you look at it, well, that probably is too tame to get on the air.
Too tame, yeah.
They were dunking people in vats of something. Speaking of vats of something, and the manager who was so persnickety about the chips, my two biggest memories, my first visit to Scotland, which you facilitated, by the way, and I appreciate it. And I promise I'm going to pay that bill for the hotel damages. My two strongest memories, other than my two strongest non-radio memories, one is the taxi ride in from the airport.
Mm-hmm.
And the taxi driver is very talkative. And he talked to me the whole trip. And he talk. And he turned around and look at me and go, And I go, oh, yeah. And he continued. I didn't understand a word.
Mm-hmm.
And that was my first clue that the brand of Scottish that we in America hear in Scottish movies made for international or at least American consumption is different than the brand of Scottish for movies made in Scotland.
Yes.
The other strong memory that I'm reminded of when you talk about the manager who was so fastidious about the chips was you guys put me up at a very nice hotel. Mm-hmm. It was lovely. And each morning I go downstairs for breakfast. And what I discovered is apparently in Scotland, a single breakfast satisfies your entire weekly recommended minimum of vegetables if you classify lard as a vegetable.
Yeah.
Because I'm not trying to, be the typical impolitic, impolite American, but
you do very well.
fried lard. There was deep fried lard. There was whiskey battered deep fried lard. And it really was, it's striking. All I could think about was the cholesterol and the clogged arteries. That also was my first, it was my introduction to something that is not just Scottish, it's throughout the UK, fried bread, mm-hmm. which most Americans have not heard of fried bread, and they would think it's a joke. I mean, if you said, what'd you have? Oh, I had some nice fried bread. Oh, really? Yeah. And anyone who was not, it's incredibly tasty.
Well, I think the suspicion was that the bread might be healthy, so we'd better fry it.
Yeah. And it's really, it's like eating deep fried cake.
Yeah.
So those are my two big.
Yes, although I do have to come back on you in that, because there's been a trend recently for the American breakfast to be available here. You go into cafes and restaurants and they say, would you like the American breakfast? And you get a stack of pancakes with bacon and a jar of maple syrup to pour over it.
No potato, no hash browns?
Yeah, hash browns as well. Yeah.
The toast?
But the setup is the thing.
Okay. And in reality, American breakfast is grabbing something from the refrigerator as you're running out the door. Most Americans do not eat pancakes on any given day. Most Americans did not eat pancakes for breakfast. That's really why I wanted to come on and record this with you, because that stereotype bothers me, and I wanted to, fight it. It's
yes.
And I know how in Scotland you refer to Americans as pancake eaters, and that's kind of offensive. It's really not.
No, it's crazy pancake eaters.
Those are the Canadians. You actually mentioned me in the book, and I don't know. You didn't. You said something, but you didn't further explicate it. So I'm asking this not so much out of ego as, wait, there's something about me and I don't know what it is. You said that you first encountered Dan O'Day at the radio festival in Cardiff, Wales.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Do you remember it? Yeah.
Oh, gosh, yeah. And my favorite part of that was just the road signs.
Welsh, yeah.
20 letter name without any vowels, 40 kilometers. But you said you first encountered Dan O'Day at the radio festival in Cardiff, Wales. What and you made some comment, I forget what it was, but some impression I made. What do you remember of that specifically about me? I'm not looking for a compliment.
I know you're not. Yeah, I mentioned you several times throughout the book because I kept coming back to things that you taught me either at that initial radio festival or in subsequent seminars. But that first encounter with you, you did a very short stint, first of all, on stage in the main festival, and then you did a kind of hour-long workshop, I think, later on. You came on stage, and you know these festivals can be a bit dull sometimes because they never quite live up to the expectations of the program. You know,
not in my country. Believe me, they're always. I don't know what you're talking about, but okay. Theoretically, I suppose it could be possible that sometimes there is dullness.
Yes. Anyway, you came on. First of all, you weren't dull. You were very entertaining. You were funny, and I think you were talking about how to handle on-air talent, and you were telling stories about the station manager who would say, just before the jock went on air, say, "Can I see you after the show?" And then that would worry them for the next 2 hours. You know?
Absolute worst thing a jock can hear.
Yeah. So that, I remember thinking, oh gosh, that's so true. That's so true, that kind of nonsense. And then in your workshop afterwards, you were playing lots of audio clips of things we always knew were wrong, but no one had actually put it together as well as you had in terms of here's some very simple do's and don'ts about how to do radio. So you heard these things and you thought, that's not good radio, but you couldn't quite place what was wrong. So one example I remember you telling us was a host interviewing a guest where someone would say afterwards, you can tell me about that after the show. And you said, tell me about that after the show. And you said, all that does is make us think that all the interesting stuff is going to happen after the show, and you're getting the rubbish. You know, you're getting.
I don't remember what the clip was, the audio clip, but the guest starts to say something, interesting, and the host said, "Oh no, well, you tell me that after the show." And I go, "What?"
Yes.
Let's get back to the questions. So that's interesting.
So there was lots of little illustrations of that. But what I remember most, the overall theme was about not doing things just because you were told to do them by your station manager or because it was on your script to do them, but owning the content and making it your own. So not doing what you heard another radio station doing, but maybe stealing the inspiration for the idea and doing something very different from it. Even in that hour, there was lots that just struck a chord with me, and I thought, yeah, I've heard these mistakes in every radio station I've listened to. And when I became the station manager for Radio Scotland, I invited you over. There was 2 reasons for that. One is I genuinely thought, you had a lot to share and people would enjoy what you had to say as much as I had, but also because I wanted the talent and the production teams to appreciate that we'd gone to all the trouble of bringing this guy over who'd flown over a continent, flown over an ocean, and therefore we were really serious about making improvements and making a difference. And as you've probably encountered in every visit you've made to any place in the world, there's always a group of people who just buy into it immediately, and there's the cynics in the background with their arms folded. He's got nothing to tell me. I've worked in radio for 20 years. He's got nothing to tell me.
I'll tell you a secret. When that happens, if I'm going to a radio station to do air talent coaching training, if it's a well-established station, I'll ask in advance, okay, who is the one person who's been on the air for 30 years and knows everything? Because that would be the kind of person who often would be like this. And I don't blame them, because in their minds, some consultant is being brought in. And I don't even use the C word to describe myself. I'm a radio guy. So what I still do to this day in that scenario is I have the person pointed out to me in advance, and within the first 5 minutes, I'll say something. Let's make up a name. Scott Rogers. And I'm making that up. It doesn't stand for anybody. I'll be saying something and I'll say, and I'll bet Scott can tell you lots of stories about that. You've seen that a lot, haven't you? And Scott will go, oh, yeah. And suddenly, I magically transform from bad guy to somebody who apparently knows a little bit about radio. Well, now my ego curiosity is satisfied. You did something I am sure was not influenced by me at all. But when I read about it, I thought, oh, that's great. That's the kind of thing I would talk about at workshops. At the BBC, you created something called Life on the Bench. Is that the right?
Yeah.
What's the backstory? Why did you create it, and what was it?
Well, this comes down to something that's always concerned me, because I was, first and foremost, I was a news reporter. and a journalist. And I worry, and I still worry, that journalism has become, to some extent, information processing rather than journalism. And by that, I mean, you've got lots and lots of very, very busy people who work very hard and go home very tired of an evening, but very few of them are actually originating stories, finding new stories. A lot of them are taking a story that was perhaps in a newspaper or a press release, making a radio story, making a television story, putting it through the pipeline, sharing it with other parts of the BBC, and all of that takes time. You find the pictures to match the story, you find the audio to match the story, but it's not journalism, it's processing. Mm-hmm. And when I've had various kind of training initiatives, I was trying to explain this to kind of young trainees, and I said, stories come from talking to people mm-hmm. and listening to them. And listening I did take this expression from you. You said there's two parts to a conversation, and you always throw out the question. The first part is talking, and you ask the audience to tell you what the second part is, and they always say listening. And you say, not on radio, it's usually waiting to talk, because people aren't listening.
I do say that, but what you just said really illustrates radio. Because what you just said is factually incorrect in one key element. When I'm going to talk about that, I'll say, when we're talking about team shows, usually how someone's talking, the other person's just, oh, you're done, I'll say my lines now. And I'll say, in reality, conversation has two parts. It consists of talking and waiting to talk. Now, my point is, I didn't ask the audience.
All right.
But that's radio, because I certainly did set it up with the aim and the intention of getting them to fill in the blank.
Yes.
But in your memory, you probably can see me asking.
Yes.
Because you painted some picture. And that actually is a line that I read many, many years ago from who at the time was a funny writer. I don't think she's still writing, but a woman named Fran Lebowitz. So I didn't even make up the line, but I thought it was appropriate. And how did we get there?
Well, so
life on the bench.
I was explaining this to the students, and I said, the real skill is in talking to people and winning their trust so that they tell you something about their life. And if you open that trust up to such extent, they will always tell you something interesting. So I illustrated this. I said, we're going to invent a program called Life on the Bench. So I took my recording machine, I left the building, I went over to the public park next to the studios, and I looked for people who were sitting on a park bench because they looked as if they had some time in their hands. And I introduced myself, I told them who I was, I spent the time talking to them, and then I asked them if I could record them. And within the space of an hour, I came back with 4 fascinating human interest stories. Someone who'd seen the fall of the Berlin Wall, an older woman who's being evicted from her home, a young transgender boy who's being bullied. And it all emerged just because you were willing to listen to people, and they wanted to tell you the story if they thought you were going to be receptive to it. And it comes back to that thing: if you just walk up to someone in the street and say, "Tell me something interesting about yourself," they won't know what to say, because they've got no idea of what you're interested in, and they'll be going through every memory in their mind to think, well, what should I choose? What should I choose? Whereas if you gradually lead people from one part of their life to the next, you eventually find these fascinating stories. That's for Life on the Bench. It was a nice little program, full of interesting stories.
I just thought that was a brilliant idea. I love that. Next time I do a seminar, I'll tell people about this idea that I had, that I call Life on the Bench. You would give advice to, I think they were each time there'd be a new crop of trainees at the BBC. This jumped out at me in the book. One piece of advice that you would give them?
Oh, yeah. In fact, I almost got into trouble with this advice because a new crop of trainees came in, and I had a standard kind of speech that I gave. I told them about all the opportunities they would have in the BBC and the things they could learn and the things they could do. But I always ended it by saying, however, if you get to the point in your career where you're not enjoying it, please leave and go and do something else and maybe come back later on. But don't stay here moaning and dragging everyone else down. But I got into trouble once because my boss came through the door just as I was getting to that point. She hadn't heard anything else. And she opened the door, and all she could heard saying was, "Please leave, please leave, go away and come back, but don't stay here and don't stay here and bring everyone else down." She thought it was perhaps not the most inspiring.
That's the joy of management, hearing things out of context, I guess. What I always tell radio people is quite close. If you're on the air and you're not enjoying yourself, get out, because none of us is being paid enough to be unhappy. Around the world, radio people put up with so much pressure, a fair amount coming from dealing with other positions in the building, people who might not know as much about what we do as we would like, but and telling us what to do. It's so pressure filled that if you're not even enjoying the time behind the mic, there's got to be an easier way to be underpaid.
Absolutely. Which reminds me of something else you said at one of those seminars when you talked about the DJ on air sounding as if he was just doing a kind of 9-to-5 job and was being told what to do. And I think you said, you've got to remember that the people listening to you might be in those kind of jobs where they don't have any control over their life. So they're putting on the radio for a bit of escapism and entertainment. They don't want to hear someone else who sounds like they're trapped in a job as well. You've got to make it sound as if you're free to do what you like, even if that's an illusion. And you talked about, the idea of we're going to throw things off the roof of the radio station if we like it or not.
And this is fascinating to me, the way all of us do this. We experience something and then the memory morphs a little bit. Yeah. I believe the psychological term is confabulation, I believe. Yeah. I've never said, don't complain about your 9-to-5 job or something. But what I say that gives that message is every time they hear you apparently breaking the rules, risking getting the authority mad at you, they're going, I wish I could do that. Yes. And you can do that without really
breaking the rules.
The radio station. You can look at what's on the schedule next, or the schedule. The story about the dog. I'm making this up. So that's what's supposed to be next. And you could say, follow something called a format here, and I'm supposed to play a song. But I just heard this story about a dog, and I'm going to get in trouble for this. I don't care. If I'm not here tomorrow, you'll know why. But there's this dog in Edinburgh, and people, they really embrace that. The idea you don't have to set the station on fire. Just
slightly
giving the message. This is my show, and that was my feeling as a jock actually during my 4-hour shift. This is my show. And it's the only time in which I get to ignore everybody's input and orders. And this, I literally threw a general manager out of I didn't literally throw him, but I literally ordered a general manager of the station to leave the studio because I'm on the air. I say, hey, this is my show. You're not helping. You got to leave. You might be able to fire me. I get that. But until you do, get out of my studio.
Well, my experience with that is slightly different, in which I always looked for a sense of authenticity from anyone who was on air, that they sounded as if they lived in the same world that we lived in. And they didn't sound as if their only life was in a radio studio and you put them in a cupboard at the end of the night and you brought them out the next day. And my example that I often quote to students was one of our news presenters, Bill Whiteford. He was just doing the normal drive time news show, and he was interviewing the business correspondent about, at that time, the Safeway stores in the UK were being bought out by another chain called Morrison's. What was the deal and why have they bought them out? What's going to happen to the brand? All of that usual stuff. But at the end of the interview, I always remember this, Bill said, just as an aside, I don't like shopping in Morrison's because they give you those see-through carrier bags and everyone can see what you've bought. And I remember listening to this in the car thinking, I don't like that either. Mm-hmm. Also, suddenly I had this image of Bill in a supermarket, not in a radio studio, doing things that we do, that we go shopping, And I quote this many, many times as a very small thing, but news people can sometimes feel so that they've got to maintain this formality and just be news people and only talk about news things and never reveal anything of their own personality. And I think we're even a very serious news program can come alive just by someone saying, well, I was speaking to someone yesterday and they said this, or I was walking down, they named the street they were walking down. So you actually believe that they actually did walk down that street.
And you will hear some misguided radio people, their response to that, and I'll limit it to presenters, talent, because I can see plenty of instances if it's a genuine news department where you don't want the journalist to be talking about his political preferences or something. But when you do something like that as a presenter, as a jock, it's not uncommon to be taken aside and told, but what about everyone in the audience who doesn't shop at Morrison's or What about everyone in the audience who shops at Morrison's and they don't mind the seat bag?
Yes.
Well, what about, it's, even if they shop somewhere and
Yes.
they have that in common with you,
Yes.
they've experienced see-through bags. It doesn't matter if the response is identical.
Yes.
It doesn't matter if your dog is named Little Barky and somebody else's dog is named Rex, or they don't have a dog, they have a parakeet. It doesn't matter. They'll fill in the details to forge that bond with you.
That is so true about the specifics. When I was running a morning talk show, my kids were very young. They were still in, just started school, and I would come in every day to the office and explain what was happening in the school and what was happening with the parents at the school gate and things like that. And we'd turn these conversations into items for discussion on the show, because that was the audience we were trying to reach. Then when you met listeners, they would say, I can't believe it's uncanny. You were talking at that specific time, just at the very day my kid was going through that in school. And you're thinking, well, of course, because the schools are all run kind of uniformly.
We live in the same place. We have the similar lives. Yeah.
But they were absolutely amazed that they were hearing things on the radio that was actually happening in their own lives.
And that's how easy it really can be to forge a bond with your audience. The other thing that I discovered a long time ago, if you want to look like just a genius to your audience and have them think you're the most creative person in the world and they would never listen to anyone else, is whenever there's something in the news, make note of your first thought of what you would do with it, and then don't do it. And then dig for a second or third thought, because everybody in radio, the headline is this. So everyone opens the mic and says, well, I think they ought to do that. And meanwhile, you say something that actually might not even be as funny, but you're the only one saying it. And that's not difficult. It really isn't. What's the best piece of advice or instruction you ever received in your radio career?
Well, not to blow smoke, but I was going to mention something that I think you used to have on your business card or on the little notebooks you used to give out. A quote that said, you don't create good things by removing the negatives. It's very easy as a manager. You can actually have a lovely job just by telling people to stop doing things.
Well, that's how a lot of programmers and especially consultants do it. They'll come to town and they'll do a focus group of listeners, and they'll say, okay, what don't you like about Radio X? And they'll write everything down, and then they'll go back to the station and say, okay, they don't like this, don't do that. And my expression is, in radio, you don't win by removing negatives, you win by getting people to listen. And the managers who do that, and I'm sure any radio person watching this has experienced this, the managers who, say, well, several people said that the female partner talks too often or whatever. Yeah, they don't like his laugh or whatever the heck it is. Okay, none of that, none of that, none of that, none of that. Thinking that's a winning philosophy is like opening a new restaurant in town. And before you open the restaurant, you do a survey to find out all of the local area people's least favorite foods. And then on opening day, putting up a big sign that says, we don't serve any of these foods, come on in. And the fact that people come into the restaurant, not because you don't serve food that they don't like, they come in because there's at least one thing that they like. And it's,
yes, absolutely.
I've forgotten about that, but yeah, that would be on my business card.
Where I put that into play, in commercial radio in the UK, they have the Snoop sessions. You'll be aware of the Snoop sessions.
Yes. Now you're saying, are you saying, I'm hearing Snip, are you saying Snoop?
Snoop, as in Snoopy, as in
yeah. So in American English, the word Snoop, Snoop session is what we call an aircheck session.
Yeah, aircheck.
And you and I pronounce the word differently, but that's
correct. But we didn't have those in the BBC. What we had was the debrief at the end of the show, and it gave everyone something to do. We'd all gather in a huddle and we'd discuss. And I very quickly realised that most of these meetings were a complete waste of time, as indeed, from what I hear, a lot of the Snoop sessions in commercial radio are a waste of time because they focus very much on either the negatives or people shrugging and saying, well, I kind of like that, rather than what were you trying to achieve? Did you achieve it? Let's get out the door, So
exactly.
Pretty much, 10 minutes, what did you try to achieve? Did you achieve it? Can we achieve it tomorrow? Right, let's do it.
And if you didn't achieve it, you're right, because what we call aircheck sessions, what you call Snoop sessions, if I hear something that doesn't sound good to me, what I will ask the jock is, okay, right there in that break or in that link, what were you trying to accomplish?
Yeah.
And if the person has an answer,
Yes.
I'm fine.
Yeah.
Even if it failed miserably. If the person says, well, what do you mean? I just said, I had to talk before the news. So now we got a problem. You did not have a goal to accomplish, so there was no way you could accomplish it. Whereas if you had a goal and maybe you didn't reach it, let's look at what happened. And maybe there's a way for it to be easier for you next time. But that's common dumb management I don't like that. I don't like that. And you know what? In case I put this on social media, in case I put this on Facebook, for example, if you're a radio talent or a former radio talent and you've experienced this, please say so in a comment. What it results in often is the talent, the jock, will do whatever he or she can to avoid encountering the manager. Oh, manager's coming down the hall. I'll slip into the bathroom here. And that's not a good sign. It's.
Well, sometimes it's the opposite. And sometimes the opposite. The manager's afraid of the talent.
Well, that's the natural order. The manager's afraid of the talent. That means everything's a smoothly running ship. That good. I like that. And you got, I think it was Jay Leno gave you some great advice. Am I thinking?
Yeah, that was when
we came. Am I thinking of the right Leno? Yeah, it was Jay.
We came to Hollywood for a week. I say Hollywood, we were broadcasting from KUSC in near a freeway underpass somewhere.
So for people who don't know, KUSC is the student radio station of the University of Southern California.
But we spent the daytime, trying to record interviews with movie stars and so forth. And we went to see Jay Leno. And it turns out his mother was, either his mother or his grandmother was from Scotland. So Scottish accent. He was very friendly. He would meet, obviously, lots of fans and viewers. And he said, I shake hands with everyone. I'm as friendly as I can be with everyone because I view every handshake as another fan, another viewer. And they will always remember that they met me. And the opposite of that is, they go away disillusioned and never watch you again. And it is something we've got to remember, that overcoming a natural modesty, perhaps, but, each one of these listeners has taken the time to try and make contact with you, and you should respect them. I think there's a real danger in radio sometimes that when someone makes contact with the radio station, you just assume that there's something not right about them. They're not right in the head in some way.
Which also says something about us. The people who love what we do the most, we disparage because they like what we do so much.
Yes.
We have names, unflattering names for them.
So it was. Someone who was as successful as Jay Leno was saying every viewer counts, and that always struck a chord with me as well.
Working for the BBC, you don't have to deal with account executives. That sounds like a blessing.
Well, you do to some extent. There was always a business manager telling you what your budget would be. When I took over the running of the radio station, I separated these people from the creative people because they would tend to sit in the meeting and say, you can't afford to do that. And what I did was I would deal with the money separately in another meeting. Wow. Let's get more people around the table to talk about ideas. If the idea is good enough, I will go and find the money to do it, But what you don't want is someone sitting there immediately killing every idea simply because of cost, And that created a much more fruitful atmosphere where people felt there was a chance to try new ideas. And actually, the biggest thing I think about working for the BBC is you always had permission to fail. You could try many ideas, and you weren't going to lose your job the next day because something didn't work. As long as you were learning from it, that was the motto. One of the director generals, one of the top guys at the BBC, was a guy called Greg Dyke, and he used that expression. He says, you can fail and you can fail again. However, if you fail 14 times in a row, we might start asking some questions. But he said that out loud. You could just feel the burden on people's shoulders lifting, saying, let's get back to what we love doing, trying ideas, being creative. We're not a commercial company. Our money's guaranteed. We don't have to go out and earn it. So let's use that financial freedom to do what the other broadcasters aren't doing and try different ideas. And that period with that kind of management was one of my happiest periods of working for the BBC, because we were all working collaboratively and we were all trying new ideas, some of which worked and some of which didn't.
What you just said implies that there may have been one or more other director generals who did not engender that.
Yeah, each of them had their different style and their different philosophy and their different focus. Before Greg Dyke, there was John Butt, who was very much about sorting out news and what we call the mission to explain and making sure the journalism was as rigorous as possible. Greg Dyke was much more entertainment and creatively focused. Subsequent director generals have either had to deal with political flack and make sure the BBC survives political attacks. So those few years of Greg Dyke, it was one of the kind of golden periods of the BBC, I think, where people worked together and they weren't fighting with each other. You know, they were we can do this if we work together. Can you help me with this idea? Can you work across television and radio? Can we work between Scotland and London and do this? And huge initiatives came out of that. You know, so it just shows you the difference that one leader and one philosophy, well communicated, can actually make.
So it's not that the BBC as an entity always gives that feeling. It's whoever is leading.
Yes, the leadership is so important too, and the visibility of that leadership is so important.
Do they still say that if you have a job at the BBC, you have a job for life?
They used to say that, but it's not true. But I think that came about because, on the one hand, a very humane approach to dealing with staff. On the other hand, it's a public body, it's not a commercial entity, so it's not your own money you're losing, so things take a long time to resolve. If someone needs to be disciplined in some way, then it wasn't overnight. It would stretch out for months, you know. So
by the time it went up the chain or whatever, that person who could discipline you might no longer be there or be in a different
sometimes that happened, or you could be lost in the system, or there was an appeals process. That led to, on the one hand, people saying that these things take too long to resolve, and the other hand, staff saying you're not dealing with the bad performers. But I remember standing in front of my huge team of radio staff and saying, can all the bad performers put their hands up so that I know who you are? And I said, I'm quite surprised because you all tell me individually about other people who aren't performing well. So I'm surprised no one's put their hand up yet. You know,
you could have made individual name tags and also have a bad performer and cite the name of the person who told you that. So it clear up that confusion. The name of the book is The Red Light Zone: An Insider's Laugh and Tell of BBC Radio. I coined the expression laugh and tell because people said to me, is this going to be a kiss and tell, which is the typical revolutionary book? And I said, no, it's not that kind of book. I said, most of my career, I was laughing, it was fun. And we had a great time, so it's telling stories, and hopefully you'll find them as amusing as I do. And it's like I say, Jeff is, I don't know. I'm going to guess it's natural because when I sat down to read the book, I knew there'd be good content because, Jeff is very accomplished and he's all these experiences, but I had no idea, okay, am I going to have to get into it slowly? But from the first words, you're just talking like one does on a good personality does on radio. You just jump right in, you're talking, and we're there. When you get the book, look at how it begins. He doesn't waste time setting things up, introduction, it's just boom, we're there. And that's what, when we do it well, we do on radio. We just jump in and invite the listeners along. So I do hope everyone will get their own copies on Kindle. And so that link should take you right to it. And for the people who get your book, if they want to give you feedback on it, does the book have contact info for you? I don't think it does. There's a website attached to the book called theredlightzone.com. Theredlightzone.com. Okay. Redlightzone.com. And I'm keeping a kind of daily blog, as it were, of the process of the book being published and what's happening and the press reaction to it. And obviously, this interview with you, Dan, will feature on that as well. Oh, cool. We'll talk about licensing, afterwards. Yeah, well, I'm just trying to bring people along in the process because I always thought it must be a fascinating process to write a book and what happens when you publish it. So everything is there from my visit to the printers when it rolls off the presses to the launch day and the press articles that are being written about it. So there's a capacity to comment on that as well. I would love it if you guys would comment on the video, and then after you read the book, make a comment on Jeff's blog.
A friend cracked the code of this book by saying, so the people who aren't mentioned are the people you don't like. And I said, it might well be true.
You could sell an appendix to it, and for an extra 10 quid, and a list of the people that I chose not to include.
Yes.
In this book.
Well, isn't that the fun of having a party about the people you don't invite?
The concept of being invited to a party, there must be some Scottish thing, because I don't know what that means. It's not an experience of mine, so that's beyond me. We mentioned the TV show W1A.
Yeah.
And which is very witty. I could just feel that it was real. Whether I'm right or wrong, it felt spot on. But if those of you who have watched the show, you might recall one of the ludicrous things that happens is when the BBC launches a new initiative and they appoint someone whose title is the head of better.
Yes.
Which I think is hysterical. And then I'm reading in your book where the BBC initiatives included extending choice.
Yes.
And making it happen.
Yes.
Head of better really isn't much of a stretch from those.
No.
Okay, are Scottish and or UK radio engineers weird?
Aren't radio engineers the same all over the world?
So that's a yes.
They read magazines with pictures of circuitry in them. So
this has not been set up at all. I'm not going to explain it. I'm just I'll go for it. And guys, those of you who are on the air, this is what I mean. This might go nowhere. In which case, I'll be going, oh darn. But if it goes somewhere, I'll be happy, and you might remember it even. Here we go. Ready, Jeff? Do you ever have the radio dream?
The radio dream whereby you're in the studio and the mic goes live, and either you can't read the words in front of you, or you don't know what you're saying, or some other embarrassment. Yes,
that's
of course, I still have the radio dream.
I love the fact that you never have to explain it to somebody. No, if I ask a radio person, they don't say, "What's that?"
Yeah.
They'll oh yeah, and then their dream will be, details will be different, but it's the same feeling, and that's why I think the one universal that binds us together are the night terrors that we feel, especially after we've left radio. Is there anything I haven't asked you about or given you a chance to talk about that you'd liked?
No, you're very generous. This has set me up for any future interviews. I think I've answered every question.
So this has been the interview from hell, and all others will be a breeze.
Not at all.
Oh, and by the way, the book is great. I'll hold up a copy. There's the book. Okay, well, I have a Kindle version.
I've got one.
This isn't the book. I have the Kindle version. This is Cross-Examination Science and Techniques. It's 950 pages, and it's really good, but I don't have a physical copy. But if I had a physical copy, this is what it would look like. It's a really cool book. And the one disappointment I had is apparently, because you didn't reveal it in your book, to this very day, apparently no one has ever figured out what BBC stands for. Is that right?
No one, no, secret. I can't tell you even. So.
Okay. Jeff, it's great to see you. It's been quite a while, and I want to thank you for coming to some of my stuff in the States, but also for giving me the extremely enjoyable experience of coming to Scotland, and more than that, getting to meet Scottish radio people. There's a bond among radio people, and I just want to thank you. And
I have to tell you, Dan, tomorrow night I'm in Edinburgh, and I'll at a meeting of radio people. It's the Radio Academy in Scotland, and they'll be thrilled to hear that I've had this chat with you.
Well, I don't know what to say that other than if you run into some people who I might know, please say hello. Jeff Zyncinski, and by the way, yes, that is such a common Scottish surname.
Yes.
I'm sure everyone thinks it's your air name, but that is your real name, as Scottish as it sounds.
Yes, it's as Scottish Polish as it sounds.
Yeah. Thank you for letting me read the book, and thanks. It's really been fun talking to you. And
thank you.
Here it's midday where I am, and so I'm going to, and I haven't eaten yet, so I'm going to, as soon as we sign off here, I'm going to have a big platter of mutton stovies with oatcakes.
Well, here it's 11 p.m., so I'm going to have a big platter of mutton stovies with oatcakes.
I got to think about that sometime. Yeah, so that's a typical American thing. So what's a traditional way of saying goodbye that a Scottish way of saying goodbye that has warm feelings?
I would just say cheerio. That would
To
be enough.
you?
Yeah, cheerio.
So and then the other person, they respond to you?
I would just say the same back to you. So
Okay, let's try it. So it's time to go. Thanks for being here, Jeff. Got anything you want to say to me? To you.
That was slick.
It was, man. We're pros, but we'll fix it in the mix.